Democratic Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas tweeted out a graphic this week that shows the names and employers of 44 Trump campaign donors in San Antonio, the people who contributed the maximum amount allowed by campaign finance laws. Congressman Castro wrote that, quote, their contributions are fueling a campaign of hate that labels Hispanic immigrants as invaders. Later adding on Twitter, how about I stop mentioning Trump's public campaign donors and he stops using their money for ads that fuel hate? And Congressman Joaquin Castro joins us now. He is vice chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and member of the Select Committee on Intelligence. And we should mention is also chairman of his brother Julian's presidential campaign.
So, Congressman, thanks so much for being with us. First of all, let's start at the very beginning, because I know there are a lot of Republican office holders who have been lying through their teeth about how dangerous this is, that it's somehow that you are putting things out that are secret. Let's just start at the very beginning. These FEC lists are public. There's complete transparency. I don't know about in your hometown, but when I was running for Congress, they always published the names in the newspapers of the contributors who contributed to the candidates. You did nothing that everybody didn't already know. Is that correct?
And also, Joe, and before I get into the discussion, I want to mention that some of these Republicans said that I doxed these people. Doxing is when you tell somebody's physical address or phone number. None of that was in this graphic that I shared, which was first put up and circulated by a local Indivisible group. My post was actually a lament. If you look at my language, I said that it's sad that these folks, many of whom are prominent business owners in San Antonio, a city that's about 65% Hispanic, their customers, the people that have made them wealthy, their employees, the people that have worked for them for years, many of those folks are Hispanic, and they're giving their money to a guy who's running ads talking about Hispanics invading this country. So it was a lament about all of us go to the restaurants these people own, the businesses that they own. We patronize these places, and they're giving their money to this guy who's taking their money and using it to buy Facebook ads talking about how Hispanics are invading this country, and that there is a cost to that. We saw the cost to that in El Paso over the weekend, that people died. The manifesto that guy wrote could have been written by the people that write Trump speeches. And, you know, I've never... A
lot of the language, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
I was going to say a lot of the language is there. And so let's go into the next step, because you are right. There is a connection. We showed earlier this week that a large number of Donald Trump's ads talk about Hispanic invasions, illegal immigrants invasions. The president, of course, has talked about Hispanics being breeders, talked about Mexicans being rapists. Somebody said at a rally, as you know, shouted out that Hispanic immigrants should be shot. The president laughed and made a joke about it. The chance of send her back just this month. It's very clear this is what the federal government itself has called in guidelines racism and white supremacy. And if you are funding ads that do that, then you're exactly right. It seemed to me that Hispanics have a right to know who is funding these ads that the federal government itself would call white supremacy.
No, that's right. When you make a political contribution, especially to a federal candidate, that's a public record. And so that graphic lists people's names, and many of them are business owners, so they actually own those companies. These are prominent donors, most of them public figures, or many of them public figures. But their money is being taken and used to fuel these hateful ads. And it has put millions of people in this country in fear. There are people right now that are living in fear, and I don't think the president understands that. I don't think those donors understand it, but they need to understand what their money is going to. And so you started the segment by noting that I'm asking Brad Parscale, who's the campaign manager for Donald Trump and who lived in San Antonio for years, I'm asking him and the other members of the Trump campaign and President Trump himself to commit to stop running ads about Hispanic invasion to this country. Stop running those ads, which are creating fear and causing danger, literally putting people's lives in danger.
Literally putting people's lives in danger. You could look at the manifesto that talks about the Hispanic invasion of Texas, how that is going to have a political impact in future elections. Again, there is a straight, direct line there. And again, I just want to repeat again, these FEC contributions and all the information that was put out there is already public record, is usually put in most newspapers around the country. Mika has a question.
Well,
Mika.
I just actually am doing some math here, and I'd love to hear the congressman sort of give his point of view on this. But, you know, the conversation out there about, you know, where this is all coming from and who's creating the danger seems kind of ridiculous. You're not releasing any new information or revealing any secrets. You are literally framing what is already public information. And wouldn't you want more people to know who is funding which presidential campaign? And if you're proud of funding President Trump, you need to understand that that will be public information. And all you're doing is trying to explain what it is in terms of the policies or the morals that you are funding. And so in a world where we have talk show hosts that want to say that white supremacy doesn't exist, it's not a problem, you have a president that spews hate speech, okay? And the question I guess I have for your critics is who's creating the danger? Because I would think that African Americans are in danger. I would think that immigrants are in danger. I would think Latinos are in danger. And that's the danger we should be talking about. That's my question.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I made the point that their money is going to fuel these ads, and that's creating a danger. It's inciting hate towards a community. And so that's creating a danger for millions of people. And we saw an instance where there's a cost to that. In El Paso, the terrorist, the shooter, basically mimics a lot of the language that President Trump himself has used, and that's consistent with those Facebook ads. So, you know, giving money to Donald Trump at this point it should not be considered just the cost of doing business, or I want to. I'm a Republican in good standing, so I want to support the president. You're giving money for somebody that's going after a community, and people have gotten killed because of that.
Congressman, it's Willie Geist. It's good to see you this morning. So what is the objective here? What do you hope will happen to the 44 private citizens whose names you posted? Do you want people to boycott their companies, protest outside their homes? What's the goal here?
No, that was never my goal. Like I said, my post was actually as a San Antonian. My family has been here since 1922. It was a lament. So it wasn't meant as a boycott. It wasn't meant to target these people. It was meant to draw attention to the fact that we've got a lot of people in our community who are respected by San Antonio, who are contributing to this guy that's using their money to fuel hate. And so what I hope is that this has started a conversation about what exactly Donald Trump is doing with these people's money. And I hope that these donors in San Antonio and donors throughout the country, unless you support the white nationalism and the racism that Donald Trump is paying for and fueling, then I hope that you, as a person of good conscience, will think twice about contributing to his campaign.
But, Congressman, as you look at this list, I know you said you didn't put their addresses out there. It's easy to find them. These people undoubtedly are already being harassed online, or perhaps face-to-face in some cases. They could be. What do you say to those people this morning who said, I made a campaign donation, and now I'm going to be harassed? I'm going to have people protesting outside my business or perhaps even my home. What do you say to them? Do you want them to repent for their support for Donald Trump, or what do you want from them?
Well, the first thing is that I don't want anybody harassed or targeted.
But they will be, because you put their names in public.
Like that was not my intention.
But that's what will happen.
These things are public. No, what I would like for them to do is think twice about supporting a guy who is fueling hate in this country.
And do you agree?
I mean,
do you agree
public
in this,
information.
Congressman? Do you agree that in this culture, and believe me, I'm making no equivalency to what Donald Trump's doing. We're on the record on this show 3 hours a morning about the ads that they're putting up, about the rhetoric he uses. But if you agree that rhetoric can lead to incitement, even if it just triggers one person to do something terrible, does it give you any pause about putting these people's names out in public?
Well, Willie, they're already public. They're already out there.
There are 11 retirees and one homemaker who are not public.
Right. And this was already circulating. I shared it, so I didn't create the graphic. No, I think, if anything, I think what I am concerned about is the distraction from the fact that people are grieving in El Paso, that these folks just got killed, and there are funerals that are being planned right now. And the world and the country should be focused on that, and on the country coming together and healing, and the country unifying. So I'm concerned about all of that. I don't want anybody on the left or the right to be a target of any crazy person, of any person who means them harm at all.
Well, it'd be nice to hear, actually, those that are contributing to Donald Trump say the same thing.
Yeah.
Because here's a guy who, again, laughs when Hispanics, when people in his audience are whipped into such a frenzy that somebody says shoot Hispanics that are coming into the country, and Donald Trump laughs about it. They have fascist chants of sending her back for non-white members of Congress.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's yeah. I have heard so many stories from folks over the last few years, but in particular the last few months, as this campaign has started to intensify, about how they don't feel safe. These are brown-skinned people that can't hide their skin color. They can't hide themselves in public. He's made them a constant target. They can't get away from that. Every time they go outside, they're fearful. So, yeah, you've got a lot of people in this country that are living in fear because of this president. And what I'm asking for is for people who are making contributions to that effort to think twice about it. And I'm directly asking the president to stop spending money on campaign ads that target an entire community and inspire shooters like the one in El Paso to go do what he did.
We agree on that, Congressman. I hope we agree, too, that incitement is bad for the country and for our politics. Congressman Joaquin Castro of Texas, thank you very much. Coming up next, presidential candidate Cory Booker is set to give a major speech today connecting gun violence to white nationalism. The setting for that address holds significant meaning. That's next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.